Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by R.H. Malden. Stivinghoe Bank. The coastline of Norfolk is one of those which have altered considerably in historic times. Along some stretches, the sea is encroached. At low water, traces of lost villages can still be seen, and in stormy weather, pieces of wood from drowned forests are sometimes washed ashore. At Cromer, a lighthouse which I remember has disappeared long since, though it was not very near the edge of the cliff when I knew it. A new one has been built at some distance inland. Along other stretches, the sea is receded, and towns which were once thriving ports are separated from it by a wide expanse of marsh, where cattle graze and abundant mushrooms can be found in early autumn. These marshes are intersected by deep and muddy channels up which the tide creeps sluggishly. But even at high water, nothing larger than an open boat can use them. The harbours whence the cloth was shipped in the great days of East Anglia, when Norwich was the third city in the kingdom and nearly wrested the second place from Bristol, are almost useless now. The towns which lived by them have dwindled to small villages. Here and there a fine old house may still be seen on the waterfront, but for the most part, the large and magnificent churches are all that remain of their former glories. Melancholy as these villages are, they have a beauty and dignity of their own. The wide horizon of marsh, beach, and sand beyond gives a sense of spaciousness which can hardly be found elsewhere. Anyone who knows them will understand why a Norfolk nursery maid, when taken to Grasmere, complained that she felt unable to breathe and that the mountains spoiled the view. They have always been well known to sportsmen, as the marshes teem with wildfowl in the winter. Of late years, artists have begun to discover them, but I must admit that I hope they will never become popular resorts. It was at one of them, which I will call Stivinghoe, that the experience, it hardly deserves to be called an adventure, which is set down here, befell me some years ago. If, when you have heard the story, you think it rather pointless, that is not my fault. I do not think that I should have admired Mr. Chadband had I met him, but his insistence on what he called the truth always seemed to me worthy of imitation, and I could not make the story more exciting without departing from the standards set by that eloquent divine. Stivinghoe differs from its neighbors in the possession of a bank, that is to say a causeway some 8 feet high running along the marshland and projecting beyond it into the sea. I suppose it is natural, as it is not easy to see why anyone should have taken the trouble to construct it. There is a rough track along the top. At the shoreward end, the sides are closed with coarse grass where sea pinks and yellow-horned poppies grow. The last half-mile is sand and shingle. At high water, the sea comes up to it on both sides. When the tide is out, it is flanked by a wide expanse of wet sand. At the far end, there is a little hillock on which are the remains of a ruined chapel. It is as lonely and desolate a spot as can well be imagined. I suppose the chapel had escaped demolition, because it had never been worth anybody's while to pull the walls down and cart the material away. It was a cell of the great house of Walsingham, and had been established as a place where prayer might be offered continually for fishermen along the coast and all who got their living from the sea. After the dissolution of the monasteries, a large part of the lands of Walsingham had gone to the Earl of W., whose descendant is still one of the magnates of Norfolk. I had reason to believe that some books from the library had made their way to his great house in Fulham. There was no adequate catalogue of them, and as I had known Lord W.'s son at Cambridge, I ventured to write and ask whether I might come and look at them. His reply was very cordial. He regretted that he could not ask me to stay, as the family was away and the house shut up. He had written to the housekeeper telling her to let me see anything I wanted, and added that while the only inn in the village was not to be recommended, I should be sufficiently comfortable at the Fishmonger's Arms in Stivinghoe. The map showed me that the distance from Stivinghoe to Fulham House was only about 3 miles. A bicycle would solve the question of transport. I had never slept at the Fishmonger's Arms, but had had tea there more than once when exploring the neighborhood, and my recollection of it confirmed Lord W.'s opinion. Accordingly, I wrote engaging a bedroom, if possible with a table where I could write, for a week, and established myself there one fine afternoon in the middle of September. The greater part of the next 3 days was spent in the library at Folkham. The result was, however, rather disappointing. The manuscripts were not many. Neither the contents nor the workmanship were of outstanding interest. I thought I had got to the end of them when I came upon a bundle of papers tied up with tape and docketed, in a modern hand, Stivinghoe Chapel. The housekeeper had just come into the room with some tea, and I noticed that she seemed disconcerted when she saw the bundle in my hand. "Are these private papers, do you suppose?" I said. "They were on the same shelf as some other manuscripts. Is there any reason why I shouldn't read them? I see that somebody had them out not very long ago." "Yes, sir," she said. "That were his lordship's father, that were. The day before the great storm. Not that that had anything to do with it, I do suppose. No, I don't see there'd be no harm, if so be as you're careful, sir." Of course I told her I would take great good care of them, that I was accustomed to handling old books and papers and so forth, but I couldn't help thinking that that was not quite what she meant. It was too late to do any more that day, so I said I would come back and go through them tomorrow morning. I mounted my bicycle at the front door expecting to enjoy the ride home, as it was a beautiful evening, but somehow I did not. For some reason I felt uncomfortable and could not get rid of the idea that there was someone following me. Though after all, why shouldn't there be on a public highroad? And what harm could he do me in broad daylight if he were evilly disposed? All the same, so strong was the feeling that I looked behind me more than once. But I had the road to myself. All the same, I rode faster than usual, and was glad when I found myself at the Fishmonger's Arms. After dinner I went to the bar parlor as usual, and got into conversation with its frequenters. The talk was of the usual description in such places, interesting enough to anyone who, like myself, can find pleasure in listening to reminiscences of past harvests, speculations as to the quality of the next one, the market price of beasts and local affairs generally, but not worth attempting to set down here. The company broke up early and I went to bed. Contrary to my usual custom, I did not sleep very well. I was troubled by a recurrent dream, the details of which eluded me, try as I would to recall them. The general sense was that I was going somewhere where I expected to meet, or at least feared that I might meet, someone whom I did not want to see. Just as I was on the point of coming face to face with him, I always woke up. This performance was repeated with monotonous regularity 4 or 5 times between midnight, which I heard on the church clock, and dawn. As soon as it was light, I gave up trying to sleep and read until it was time to get up. After breakfast, I bicycled down to Folkham House as usual and got out the bundle of papers. They proved more interesting than I had expected. They belonged to the years 1531-32 and appeared to relate to the incumbent of the chapel at the end of the bank. John of Costessey was his name. The first document was brief. It was addressed to the prior and convent of Walsingham, and was a request bearing about a dozen signatures, of which 3 seemed to be those of the rectors of Stivinghoe and 2 neighboring villages, that John might be recalled to Walsingham and someone else dispatched to take his place. Presumably the prior wrote, as he was bound to do, to ask the reason for this request, for the next letter was considerably longer. It appeared that John was suspected of having entered into a compact with the powers of evil. He was a man of violent and vindictive temper, and it was noticeable that those who offended him were dogged by persistent and inexplicable misfortune. Next time they went to sea, they met with no fish, or nets broke mysteriously as a catch was being brought on board. Unaccountable accidents, some fatal, occurred on board their boats. More than once a boat had been lost with all hands in a sudden and very violent storm, which had not been foreseen by the most weather-wise seamen along the coast. More than once he had been seen from the boats rounding the end of the bank close inshore to make the harbor, standing at the water's edge with an imp seated upon his shoulder. The said imp had screamed and waved its arms. Here followed an illegible word which I guessed to be meant for devilishly. More than once at night time the window of the chapel had been seen to be brightly lighted, and bursts of song were heard proceeding from it. These melodies did not suggest the familiar offices of the church, and more than one voice seemed to be taking part. Next came a letter from John himself, obviously in answer to a communication from the prior. He protested that he could not be expected to reply in detail to such malicious and unfounded charges, and hinted that if his nocturnal vigils had been solaced by celestial company, no fault could be found with him on that score. The prior's answer to this may be inferred as to have a summons to repair to Walsingham forthwith. John's next letter was to the effect that his austerities, which it was his delight to practice, had made him too feeble to undertake the journey on foot, while the hard-heartedness and irreligion of the countryside, of which the prior had ample proof, made it unlikely that any attempt to borrow so much as an ass would be successful. The prior could hardly be expected to put up with this, nor did he. He must have told John that he proposed to visit him in person, for the last letter was as follows. Although we are forbidden to take pleasure in the things of this life, yet when I have seen here with my eyes the most holy prior, together with my two dearly beloved brethren, I shall gladly say, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart, etc. Well, I said to myself, he must have been an impudent rascal if nothing else. But he seems to have had a sense of humor, and have been pretty sure of his ground. I wonder how the story ended. Next moment I gave a violent start, for I heard what sounded like a laugh close behind me. I whipped around in my chair, but there was no one there. The library was a large room, and I was some distance from the door. Although the carpet was thick, I did not think anyone could have come in without my knowledge. However, I got up and went all round the room and even looked behind the window curtains. Of course I found nobody, and sat down again feeling rather ashamed of myself for being so fanciful. There was only one more paper to be examined. Unfortunately, the top had been torn off, and the first words remaining were, "could not be found anywhere." Then followed an inventory of the contents of the chapel and cell. The only unusual item was 2 candles of black wax. I concluded that the prior had paid his visit, but that John's nerve had failed him at the last moment and he had disappeared. He could have made his way to Lynn without much difficulty, and got on a ship bound for the Low Countries. No doubt the prior was not sorry to be rid of him, and as the inventory was dated 16 September 1532, the convent soon had other things to think about. On my way home I speculated, not for the first time, upon the question of whether there is or can be any foundation for any of the stories of compacts between human beings and evil spirits. In the abstract, the possibility seems difficult to dispute. The belief is ancient and widely diffused. The real point seems to be whether the game could be worth the candle. As I had finished all I meant to at Folkham House, I decided that I would spend tomorrow on a visit to the chapel and perhaps sketch it. The day after, I would return home. When I imparted my plan to the landlord, he naturally expressed a civil regret that my stay at Stivinghoe was coming to an end. He seemed doubtful whether the ruins, as I had learned the chapel was called locally, were worth visiting, seeing as it were a dull trudge along the bank to get there. I thought from his manner that this was not his only reason for trying to discourage me, but he was summoned elsewhere before he had time to say more. While I was at dinner, he looked in to see if I had everything I wanted. There was an unusual piece of condescension, and I suspected an ulterior motive of some sort. I was not mistaken. After a moment or two, he made an obvious effort. "You'll excuse me, sir, but the ruins is a queer place. Rare goings-on there in those ancient times, by what I've heard." This was interesting, as it suggested that some reminiscence of John Costessey lingered on in the scene of his activities. But before I could ask for the details, he went on rapidly. "Not that I've any call to listen to the fishermen's talk, no more than you have." After this there was obviously no more to be got out of him, but I thought I would try to cast among the company in the parlor later on. After some miscellaneous conversation, I mentioned that I thought of spending my last day in walking out along the bank and making a sketch of the ruins. For some reason the company seemed to find this proposal disturbing. No one made any comment, but there was an awkward pause. Then 2 ancients near the fireplace held a short, muttered conversation. The only words I could catch sounded like, "Not lately, have ye?" Plainly they knew more than they meant to tell. Presently someone introduced some ordinary topic, and the conversation flowed as easily as before. I went to bed about 11 and slept soundly. Next morning I started soon after breakfast. I had ascertained that the tide would be low between 1 and 2 p.m., so that I should be able to find a position from which to make a sketch. I could hardly do this if I were confined to the bank itself. Also the day, though fine, was windy enough, I thought, to make the top of the bank a wet place at high water. I asked for some sandwiches to take with me, and said that I should be back in time for dinner as usual, probably for tea. I thought the landlord looked at me rather reproachfully, but he said nothing. When I had gone a few steps on my way, I found that I had not filled my tobacco pouch that morning. I turned back to make the omission good, and my eye was caught by a horseshoe nailed over the front door. Nothing remarkable in that, you may say, but I wondered that I had not noticed it before, as it now seemed to be unusually conspicuous. The walk along the bank was pleasant enough. I could see over miles of marsh on either hand. Inland there were groups of red-roofed cottages to be seen, with occasional windmills and church towers. In front of me lay the sea. At the moment no fishing boats were visible, but the smoke of 1 or 2 large ships could be seen on the horizon. Altogether an exhilarating prospect, but somehow or other I did not feel at all exhilarated. On the contrary, I had to admit that I was nervous and depressed. Certainly I had had some odd little experiences since I had touched those Stivinghoe papers. First there was the feeling that I was being followed on the way home, then my uncomfortable and inconclusive dream, then the laugh that I thought, no, knew, that I had heard in the library, and last of all the obvious conviction of the neighborhood that the ruins were better left alone. What should I do if I saw a figure emerge from the chapel and come along the bank to meet me? Should I enter into conversation, or should I get down on the sand and hope that he would pass me by? Or should I run for it? Or could I recall on the spur of the moment any form of exorcism which might prove effective? Fortunately, I did not have to answer any of those questions. The chapel was a small building, roughly built of gray flint. It measured about 22 feet by 10 and was lighted by a single lancet in the east wall. There was a door at the west end. I put its date a little before 1530. Of course the roof was gone, but the walls looked fairly sound. The altar was still in place, but I noticed that the usual consecration crosses, one in the middle and one at each corner, had been deliberately obliterated. The chisel marks could be seen clearly. Such reforming zeal seemed to be almost excessive. On the south, that is on the landward, side of the chapel, there were some small mounds which presumably indicated the site of the priest's dwelling. The superstructure had disappeared so completely that I wondered whether it had been some form of wood, also whether it could possibly be worthwhile to return with a spade. I sat down on one of the mounds and ate my sandwiches. Then I thought it time to set about my sketch. I went down onto the sand and decided that the best position was a few yards to the seaward. In this part of Norfolk, the coasts run east and west, so that the sea is to the north. The natives are fond of assuring visitors that there is nothing between them and the North Pole. No one who has been there in winter is likely to wish to dispute this statement. The tide was still ebbing, so I should have plenty of time to do what I wanted. I settled myself in my sketching materials, but somehow I did not make very good progress. I had an uncomfortable feeling, as if there was somebody behind me, and caught myself wondering what I should do if a hand, probably a large and bony one, were suddenly laid upon my shoulder. I said aloud, "Ridiculous," and as I did so a gull passed very close above my head and gave a derisive squawk, which seemed to indicate his complete concurrence. The gulls were very many, which was not surprising, but they were so tame, or impudent, whichever you like to call it, that they were a positive nuisance. They flapped their wings almost in my face, and one actually perched on my easel. I suppose they had never seen enough of men to be afraid of them. I had a sandwich or two left, which I threw as far as I could toward the water's edge. This drew them off for a little, but they were soon as bad as ever. However, I got a sketch of some sort finished. I thought I would take one more look inside the chapel before I started to walk home, in case there were any detail of interest which I had missed. The floor was covered with coarse turf. Probably it had never been paved. If it had, the paving had been covered long since. But just in front of the altar, I noticed a patch which somehow looked different from the rest. I had in my knife one of those curious implements said to be intended for taking stones out of horses' feet, and it seemed to me that at last I had a chance of using it. I scratched at the turf, and very soon my hook grated upon a stone. A little scraping disclosed a small rectangular slab about 20 inches long by 8 broad. A pentacle had been scratched upon it rather roughly. It was obviously the lid of something, if it were too small for any kind of a coffin. A little more scraping of the earth round the edges, and I got it up with less difficulty than I had expected. It was the lid of a coffin of sorts after all, and in the coffin were some bones, clearly those of a small monkey. Its 4 paws were crossed upon its breast, and from some fragments of stuff that lay about, I came to the conclusion that it had been buried in some sort of monastic habit. The discovery explained the stories of the imp. Perhaps John had been really fond of his pet, who must have been his only companion. Burial before the altar might perhaps be condoned. But the monastic habit looked like a profane jest. Or was it more than a jest? Taken in conjunction with the pentacle on the lid, the candles of black wax found by the prior, and the erasure of the consecration crosses, which I now began to think was John's handiwork and not the doing of any zealous followers of dowsing, there was a definite suggestion of serious and sinister purpose. What unhallowed rites had been celebrated there? With what evil intent? And, I could not repress the further question, in what company? However, there seemed to be nothing for me to do but to leave the things as I had found them, which I did. The afternoon was wearing on, so I started for home. The tide had probably turned, but was still very low. At the seaward end, the line of the bank was curved, so I saw that I could shorten my walk considerably if I took to the sands and struck the bank again in about a mile. When I had gone a little way, I turned back to take a final look at the chapel. It was a sunny day with big white clouds driving before the wind. As I looked, the shadow of one passed across the chapel, and by some odd trick of light made it seem as if a dark figure had emerged from the door and dropped down the far side of the bank. For a moment I was really startled. I turned and went on with my walk. I have never considered myself a fanciful person, but it was borne in upon me very forcibly that the sooner I was sitting down to tea at the fishmonger's arms, the happier I would be. Presently I reached the point at which I must take to the bank again. Just as I got to the edge of the sand, I saw the print of a naked human foot, pointing towards the bank. It was very recent and could, apparently, only have been made by someone who had passed me quite close, having come across the sand as I did, and gone up the bank before me. This was frankly impossible. Had there been anyone else about, I could not have failed to see him. The sand was too wet to hold impressions for long. Most of my own tracks had disappeared already, yet there was the footprint, unmistakably. I stooped and looked at it. There was only one, which made it odder still, closely. It struck me as unusually bony, that is to say, the bones showed more plainly than I should have expected. I thought of the shadow which I had seen pass across the end of the chapel. Had it, after all, emerged from inside? If I went on, should I find someone waiting for me? And with what intent? However, there was nothing for it but to go on. I was within sight of the village now, and there were people about who would see if any attack was made upon me, but what help they would be able to give was another matter. So on I went, and in a few minutes had reached my inn safely. I turned on the doorstep to take a look over the marshes. Very lonely and solemn they were, and very dark was the little chapel. There was no one to be seen. I had not expected that there would be, but this time the wind had freshened, and there was a hard brightness on the northeastern horizon, which foretold a full gale before morning. There was an old barometer just inside the front door, which had fallen so low that I wondered whether it were trustworthy and hoped not. The landlord emerged and appeared ill at ease, and at the same time glad to see me, possibly by reason of the weather, possibly not. He murmured something to the effect of no harm done, as he returned to his occupations. I felt curiously tired, and when I had had tea, after a poor pretense of reading some book, I forget now what, dozed in an armchair by the fire. I was roused by a clap of thunder, and the storm broke with a roar like a train. The thunder was unusual, I thought, for the time of year, especially as the last few days had not been particularly hot. Also, the wind was off the sea, and I knew that there was a belief along the coast that when a thunderstorm comes up from the sea, it will be the beginning of the end of the world. The Fishmonger's Arms was built to stand weather, but I doubt whether it ever had a worse buffeting than it got that night. There was no more thunder, but the rain came down in sheets, and the wind tore at the house till I could almost imagine I felt it swaying to and fro. It was obvious that there would be no customers at the bar, so after dinner I invited the landlord to come to my sitting room to smoke a cigar and drink a whiskey and soda with me. I was really glad of his company, and he seemed to be of mine. We tried to talk of indifferent subjects, but could not do much save listen to the wind. We went to bed about 11, though there was not much prospect of sleep. I wished that I had not remembered at that moment that Richard Kidder, Bishop of Bath and Wells, had been killed in his bed, together with his wife, by the fall of a chimney stack through the roof of the palace during the terrible storm of 26-27, November 1703. Soon after midnight there was a screech, I can call it nothing else, like that of an animal in pain. I could hardly believe that the wind could have made such a sound. This seemed to be its last effort, and the storm died away almost as quickly as it had arisen. When I looked out the next morning, the chapel was gone. The whole end of the bank had been washed away. The gale had coincided with a spring tide, and I suspect that most of the marsh had been under water for some hours. Of course, the tip of the bank had caught the full force of the sea. I must confess that I felt relieved. At first I was glad that I had made a sketch of the chapel, but after a little reflection, I burned it. Somehow I felt safer as I saw it turn to ashes. The end.